I have an idea. Let's talk about heavy metal. I'm ready. I hope you all brought your axes as well. We'll be laying down some of the approach and details to creating this non-metallic metal finish on the axe. The hardest thing for a lot of people is figuring out where those reflections are taking place. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of an exercise to start things off. The same exercise that I used to learn exactly where the reflections were taking place and how I can build around what may be a very subtle amount of light to create this dramatic non-metallic metal effect. It's all laid out in the video. Let's get our hands dirty. Let's take a look at the model. I just want to present the various areas and see how the light is playing across the form. Generally, the upward facing angles receive the brightest amount of highlight, and I want a very dramatic progression. The lower facing angles are going to be reflecting the base that he's mounted on, which is why that terracotta tone is pulled into those lower reflections. You can see on his boots, his hip plate here, and we've got this brighter reflection with a touch of yellow pulled into it to reflect the sunlight. Let's focus up on this axe though. To really understand how the light behaves on a surface, observation is the best teacher. So I took a picture of the model under a single lamp, and even the primer is a semi-gloss primer, but you can still see generally the progressions taking place. So I just want to mimic that. That's real life, right? So we'll just make a more dramatic version of that gradient that we're seeing and where all the light is being placed. So the first thing I'm going to do, just for the sake of example, is figure out exactly where that light is falling in the most major areas. Have my primary light source here, and then we'll pull in a bit of a secondary reflection. It's present in the picture, it's barely there. And then right where this middle part of the blade here, that curves and faces upwards, that will receive a very heavy amount of light. And then the other side, the light was falling across the middle of this blade, and then I know that this side, which would be facing downward, is going to receive a bit more of that terracotta orangish brown tone. And I don't normally do this before I paint a model, but for the sake of this lesson, I wanted to show you what I was seeing with my mind's eye and where all this light is falling. So we want to make a very dramatic version of that. I have my map is laid out ahead of me. Now I need to color it in and just pay attention to where the light is coming from. Next on the agenda, we have our progression, but what color will all this be? Let's take a closer look at the palette cam, do a little mixing about. So I know that the surface of the weapon, I'll mix up a gray, just a nice medium gray to represent the steel. And as we're talking about the sky and the earth reflecting on the surfaces, I know the sunlight coming downward will have yellow, and the facings that are more downward will have some of that terracotta mixed into it. And even in some of these, the deepest shadows will still be modified by their surroundings. So I'm mixing up a black with the bloodstone, and I'm throwing some yellow into this black as well, because even the shadows will be taking on the same kind of color communication. And as I'm mixing upwards, I'll be adding portions of white to either one of these colors. Still want to highlight things, probably bring more yellow into the terracotta as it moves upward as well. So that's the general look we're after. The first thing I'm going to do though, before I start layering and blending all that up, is just wet blend all these colors together. So mix up a little bit more of that main gray, pull in some yellow. And right where I've decided my brightest reflections are taking place, throw that gray and yellow mixture in place. Then I'll take some of that black and yellow mixture, sweep it into these other areas. We'll take some even more black in that mixture. See, I'm going to be mixing and matching right on the palette. Seeing as I have my brightest and darkest areas already mapped out, all the mixing is taking place around that channel of light, and we'll keep blending together. Let's pull a little bit of pure white while we're at it, and I'll leave it out of this area, but this brightest area, let's make sure to mix white into that. Now the downward facing angle, and that's why I chose the axe head, because it's basically split in half. You know, it's pretty fun. We've got one of the halves that's just facing downwards and one that's facing upward. Of course, there are always slight variations to all these rules, but we'll get our gray and bloodstone mix in there. Peel a stray brush hair off the surface, this downward facing side. And grab a little bit of black and terracotta. Yeah, that looks a little too brown. I want to get there, but I also need this progression to pass through that silver area. You know, it can't just be a brown blade. So let's bring just a little bit more of this gray into the mix. I'll be laying in some thin down layers of paint to get those subtleties in place. This is what we're working with for now. And we'll take some pure terracotta. Bloodstone, terracotta. I'm using these terms interchangeably. Now, this area, my light source is still yellow, so I will take a little bit of this yellow and gray mixture. You know, my brightest points are still going to be caused by the sunlight, so that's why we work that in. And then maybe on this side over here, it is kind of taking on a deeper shadow. It's a little bit further down on the blade. We want to over embellish these concepts, get a real nice artistic look. So I'll bring a little bit of brown into those reflections as well. And give you an idea of the general picture. That's what we're looking at. Now that things are starting to dry a little bit, I'll start cleaning my work up. Again, going to that yellow and gray mixture. Just basically going back for another pass of the wet blending to make things more saturated. You can bring a bright reflection into the middle of this little secondary channel, but very, very small amount. And maybe if that gray mixture isn't quite doing it for me, I can mix some pure yellow. Just very lightly glazing that in place. And we'll get the middle of the axe as well. And just repeating the same process, but as we've learned by now, many coats will build up a very saturated and healthy looking progression. Some of that black-brown shadow. Screw it, we'll just throw it into a little bit into this deeper area. See how it comes out. Introduce a little bit more black and brown. So I just cleaned off the brush, and I'll use the side of it to absorb up that hard edge, kind of sponging along. And we'll pick out the edges, the nice bright kind of yellow gray mixture. Right along the middle, on all these upward facing edges. Leave the downward facing angles alone for now. And wherever there's a little kind of chip in the blade, I'll pull a little bit of a line even further off of that. Start adding to the, have a little battle damage and some textures and scrapes. And right here, I want to make sure that this edge highlight is particularly bright, seeing as this reflection is running right across the face of this axe. Pull just a little bit in, across the middle, just like so. Just fortify this area a little bit more. Decent. We'll let that sit and dry, and then we'll do a little bit more layering. Once that was all set and dry, I wanted to go back with a few diluted layers, and just to make sure everything is smoothed out, my gradients are under control. I can sharpen things up a little bit, just always sweeping in the same direction so I get a nice smooth result. The roadmap was laid out for me from the very beginning with that first picture and that black and white sketch. I think it's a good way to approach non-metallic metal if you're, maybe a little intimidated by it. Just try sketching on a model with black and white. Kind of develop that instinct for where these reflections would be falling. You can see just how thin these layers are. I'll show you right here. So, dirty paint water level of thin. I want to add a little bit of black to that so I can smooth out some of the deeper areas. I still want to maintain this gradient, so mixing up little off tones, little side puddles of color, exactly what I need. Make this look just right. You can wet blend these thin layers together. I'm kind of going back and forth, and whatever way I can successfully push the paint around, get my desired result, and that is the exact path I'm taking. If you've seen my other videos, we combine a lot of techniques to get our result. I'm going to brighten up this area here. When I add white to it, it becomes a little too muted and dull, so I found adding some of that yellow to highlight these brown areas kind of keeps it in the same temperature. And I'll pull the edge highlights in with that color as well. We can see his forearm as a reference here. Alright, just a little bit more of that thinned down terracotta. Again, very thin. I'll show you right there. You see, I mainly know it's there because I've made the surface wet. I want to do this at least 3 times to get a nice smooth result. And now, a little bit of white and yellow, slight amount of black. Just don't think of it as black, white, and yellow though. Think of it as light gray with yellow. Again, getting that these brightest peaks, just very careful amounts, multiple passes just to make sure that it's perfectly saturated. I'm okay with the slight amount of texture on this blade right now because I want to add all these superficial scratches to it. I want to look like it's a well-used axe. He's not some credit card warrior with his freshly purchased unsullied blade. It's well worn. But yeah, the old trick, wherever the area may not be smooth, just add battle damage. You can see these multiple thin layers just diffusing our blend, getting a real smooth result. Let's break down to a smaller brush. I'll use a size 1 from Monument. And all these colors I've laid out, I'm just going to add very thin superficial scratches along these progressions. A little bit goes a long way. You don't want to overdo it, or maybe you do. Just be aware of your intentions. Just don't swipe all these random lines everywhere and then ask yourself why it doesn't look like battle damage. Bring these lines in from the edge of the blade, facing, towards the enemy. Here and there, even over these dark areas, you can bring some scratches across. Then in this area where, I'm using pure white towards the end of the blade, I'll break down to that gray and yellow mixture through the middle of the blade. Add some just very subtle lines, and then I can make some smaller blends as well. And maybe where things are getting brighter, I'll bring in a little bit more of that color of the base. And I'm always jumping back and forth until things look just right. I can bring some pure yellow in as well, just a very, very thin glaze. If maybe all that mixing of gray and yellow, creating that subtlety, wasn't good enough for me, then I can kind of reclaim, some of that lost yellow by just glazing some in place. And since there's a touch of it mixed into the gray, it's going to come back to life very nicely. And I'll still use a very bright pure white. It's a metallic surface, so mixing a touch of yellow into everything for sure. But if you want to get that really dramatic look, I'm going to take some white as well. I'll pick out the edges, whatever kind of filigree or designs. A little random on the sculpt, but I'm into it. And even when edge highlighting, it can still be a progression. If we look at the top edge of this blade, I use a bit of pure white just right there where everything comes together. Now for the rest of the edge, I use some of that light gray with yellow, and again pulling some yellow into the edge highlight for this lower facing angle. I even paint a little scrape in that color. And then the scrapes now in this lower facing angle. You guessed it. Just going to use that same toned edge highlight. A little bit of blending. And even in the very deepest area, just a few scrapes. You can see I'm kind of swiping my brush. I'm missing my lines here and there because I'm trying to press very lightly. The lighter I press, the finer the line will be. And then wherever some of these lines kind of break the edge, I can be sure that would be a little bit more defined. So pull just a little tiny highlight in there. And now I'm pretty much there. I'm looking at it, and this is the kind of the balancing act portion where I'll be adding things here and there, kind of looking at it from a distance. I've decided I want this progression right here. It's kind of working on these, making sure everything pulls up to a very, very compact highlight. There also might be some areas that I want to define with a little bit of a black line. I'll even take that black and just some of the deepest areas, maybe add a little bit of texture. Just some more of those tiny slashes. Let's do one more pass with the white because I want to make sure everything is nice and saturated. Break this highlight up along the center of the blade. Again, a little bit goes a long way, so you've come this far, highlighted, put all this time in. Just go back and do one more little set of highlights. And just a few more scratches. You see how this, that lack of smoothness in the beginning really doesn't matter now. Now that I have all of these scratches built up, I'm going to switch back to a larger brush, and again, very kind of broad stroke over these deeper areas just to filter everything back down. Maybe one of my scratches was a little bit too bright. In this way I can make sure we've got this general kind of flow. You know, you want the light kind of falling in waves across this surface, going from deeper and darker to higher and brighter. You know, just kind of apply the very general colors. So got the dark tone, sweep my terracotta over those chosen areas, and then just the slightest amount of yellow, very, very little. Just like that, nothing to it. And there he is, complete. The gorgeous blade of a slayer. But where you can have one, why not have two? I get ahead of myself, but I love medieval weaponry, and I love non-metallic metal. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and until the time comes in the future, the method is always the same. Keep practicing. Analyze, interpret, conquer, overcome, wear sunglasses.